Ini lagi. Hello everyone, very good morning to one and all, and a warm welcome from Team DDG and WTM Nagpur. Uh, Before getting started, a small introduction about myself. I am Ramya, Ambassador for Women Tech Makers Nagpur, and also a co-organizer for GDG Nagpur. And I hope everyone's staying safe and making the most of the quarantine because I can see many people coming out with new ideas and prototypes for their projects. And I could see some people setting up their daily goals for their specializations for online courses. And I could see many people busy with their final year projects and stuff, which I could experience for my own. And I could see people busy with their daily schedule of work from home. So, covering this diverse kind of audience, today we present you a very diverse topic, payments, which is of main importance during this pandemic, where people are preferring online payments apart from the hand cash. And also, I observe payments as a very important topic from the career perspective. So today I won't be discussing more on payments because we have a special person who will be taking us on a detailed ride about payments. And uh, before getting started, I'll be telling you a small agenda of this meetup. Firstly, we'll be having a small discussion about payment architecture on cloud platform by Dharmesh sir. Dharmesh sir is a Google developer expert for Google Cloud Platform and payments, and later on we'll be having a small Q&A section. You can post your questions while the session is going on or after the session so that we'll be communicating with sir and he will be answering your questions, and later we'll be having a few announcements after which we can wrap the session. So Dharmesh sir, the space is yours.
Okay, thanks Ramya for the good introduction, and thanks to GDG Nagpur and WTM Nagpur for inviting me for this webinar. Glad to present to you folks. So to begin with, I know like this is a very diverse topic as Ramya suggested, and payments is not something that is very easy to attain. Like, I mean, if you're developing a web app or a mobile app, it's kind of very straightforward to kind of pick some libraries and then implement the features and then go ahead and start launching it and so on. I mean, if it is like a social media app or something like a chat app or something, there are no kind of legal or regulatory requirements when you talk of any other app or any other business functionality that you think of. But payments especially is something which falls under a very regulated platform, and we'll see like in this session that what are those nuances of designing a payment system, what are the things that need to be taken care of, and is there something like readily off the shelf available for anyone to use and anyone to implement payment systems in a very fast and a very agile manner. So yeah, this is more of the agenda that we'll see today. If I had to yeah, of course, like before I start, there is a bit of disclaimer which I should post, because this is more of concepts, thoughts, or more of experience sharing, best practices around payments, which I have encountered in my professional journey. And this should not be like kind of quoted as a reference or material which is more into like legal or regulatory stuff. So yeah, that's something of a disclaimer which I usually post when I talk of payments, since it deals with a lot of techno legal and regulatory stuff. But yeah, that's more of the agenda. As Ramya was discussing today, we'll kind of see more into what payments are, and how the landscape is shaping up, and thanks to probably uh, the e-commerce or online boom which is happening right now due to lockdown. It's just adding more and more to the digitalization phase around payments and the services that are built around payments. So if you see like any new product that is coming up, it generally kind of is trying to inculcate or trying to built into payments into its ecosystem itself. So if you see the most latest example, I believe like even WhatsApp is coming up with its own internal payment mechanism, wherein you might be able to do some UPI transactions or a P2P transaction with WhatsApp itself. So maybe some competition for other players out there. Then definitely like the core agenda is what we'll be seeing like before building any payment systems, like what are the things that are to be considered, and what is the general architecture and what is going to be the workflow for designing systems. And of course at the end we'll see like since like this is more I mean we are associated with GPay as well, which is one of the most prominent platforms, if not the most popular. We'll see how basically GPay works and how you can implement it in your workflows as well. So moving on into like the actual payment space. So this is like the core architecture or the core payment flow that is applicable for any system that you design, be it like for a web, be it for a mobile, be it like any POS terminal as well, even if it's a hardware. This is the core payment request flow that is applicable to any workflow or any ecosystem. So definitely it is complicated. It's mainly due to the number of integrations between the different actors of the system, and these would mainly be like if you see over here, there is the payee, there is a payment mediator, there is a payer, there is a payment app. So what are these components? So if you see like in terms of the payment app, this is the one which is actually the one responsible for making the payment, returning the response, integrating with the payer. Like it can be the bank, it can be the merchant, it can be any even the mobile operators as well. So even now they are like into payments as well. And this component is actually responsible for storing all the payment related information, passwords or OTPs and everything, which is kind of getting controlled with this. And it is kind of expected that these payment apps are the core of designing or having the entire security and privacy feature that is given back to the user. So and of course like in future, the more robust or more user friendly the payment app is going to be, they are going to be like kind of distinguished or outshined in the market as compared to other players. uh, there can be more into like these payment apps, like how they run their loyalty programs, or what good operational behavior they have. Like say for example payment fails, and how do you contact them, how easy it is to contact them, and kind of how fast they are responding. Everything is kind of lying with this payment app. So if you see like this whole payment app itself is a ecosystem in itself, okay. And if you see the surrounding layers around it, okay, it is kind of very vast, and it's a whole universe in itself. uh, the other important part over here is the payment mediator, okay, which is often called as the payment service provider as well. So this payment kind of service provider is basically it kind of sits between the payer and the payee. Okay, when I say payee, just assume that this is the payment app in itself, okay. And it determines like what kind of payment protocols are available. So whether you can pay it with a net banking, whether you can pay with a credit card, debit card, UPI, and so on. Okay, so it is kind of making the system more user friendly, and as more and more payment mechanisms get enabled, the payment mediator has to be enabled, or use appropriate algorithms so that the payment app can kind of interact with these. Also like it is kind of responsible to get the response back to the payee from the payer. And if in case of any errors, it has to like kind of throw back appropriate errors and authorizations wherever required. So if I had to kind of show the flow, so if you see like the payment request is made, the payment mediator comes into between, uh, the payment app, whichever, like, so say for example you're going through net banking on IRCTC, and there is something called as the CC Avenue Gateway, so that you can consider as the payment mediator. The app in itself is actually your IRCTC where you have designed it, and from the payer itself, it is kind of going back, selecting the payment app, and then going back, where if the payment interaction has been successful, you get the payment request, the payment methods are sent out, and then you get a payment response on success. So basically, the whole interaction is happening through the payment mediator and the payment app over here. So to design such systems, so what exactly is to be considered? So one of the most important aspects is basically whenever it is like credit card processing. So why I'm focusing on credit card processing is that there is a very much laid down guidelines and rules when you talk of CC processing, and that's called like PCI DSS. So it is like Payment Card Industry Data Standards. There is some more S onto that. I forgot the whole abbreviation, but yeah, that's mainly the payment card industry standard for any kind of payment processing when you talk of credit cards. Then of course you need to take care of the security encryption. There is the geolocation. So if okay, so it's basically the geography, the scalability aspects. So why I'm talking of geography is because, say for example, payment systems are going to work differently in India versus how it is going to work in US or Russia or Australia. Okay, and that is why geolocations are important when it comes to designing any kind of payment systems. So there is a bit of request that I need to enlarge my screen. I think it is maximized. I'm not sure if it is now visible. Okay. So yeah, these payment systems are basically, as I was talking of, in terms of geography, every geography might have different regulatory requirements, and based on that, your system has to be designed. So that is another important feature to be taken care of. And of course, scalability is something that any system must be capable of handling. So say for example, tomorrow there is a surge in a lot of payment requests, and you need to kind of ensure that your system is robust enough to handle that. So how do you do that? So how do you design a robust architecture for that? uh, Another important part of payment, as I told earlier, is the core fact that how is your operation or customer support and your fraud analytics. So say for example there are any fraudulent payments, or you need to kind of cancel some payment, or your payment is not processing due to some reason. It kind of is a make and break situation for any payment system, app, or website that you design. And here also, like, this operational aspect of payments is very important, because it kind of affects daily life of individuals, because you might be buying something very essential where if the payment is not going through, okay, and you need to call the customer support and ensure that how it is going to happen, or how exactly you need to make that payment, okay, and if there are any problems into that, how you're going to solve that. So it's more of a business model out there into operationalizing it. So yes, you need to take into consideration all these factors when designing any payment systems. uh, so keeping apart the business aspects to this, or the regulatory aspects, one of the core components which we see is like the PCI standards for payments, okay, the security and the scalability. So these can be solved easily using technology. Of course, others also are solvable using technology, but these are the core ones which we can easily solve, or kind of easy to implement using something that is ready made. So let's kind of first understand what exactly is PCI. So it kind of relies on two principles, okay, which is like to protect the consumer data and avoid any breach or leaks. Okay, so the first aspect is basically you kind of encapsulate or kind of tokenize your credit card data so that it is not visible to anyone. And then how do you make your system itself more and more robust to any kind of attacks or breaches, or so that no one can intrude your systems, and how you design it's based on that. So so I mean, like before PCI, like there was no such implementation in place, and probably there was a certain regulatory requirement that came across by multiple card providers like Visa, Mastercard, and so on. And they kind of each one had their own internal mechanism to kind of manage the security and the layers around protection of consumer data. But then they thought, like, if they need to have cross border payments, or cross transactions, like between Visa and Mastercard, between Mastercard and Amex, and so on. Okay, you need to have a common system in place, and that is where like kind of PCI was born. So what exactly it does, or how it kind of manages, is so first of all, of course, there has to be a very strong firewall system in place. So when I say firewall, it is not as simple as your Windows firewall. There are a lot of complications or a lot of mechanisms that need to be built, and there's a lot of security testing that needs to happen for these firewall systems to be implemented. Your access control, that who gets access to what part of the entire system. So whether it's, if it's a consumer, you only get access to your data. If it's like the bank, it can access the entire data, but maybe in an encrypted format. If it's like a customer support executive, it is only when a consumer request for some kind of a operational issue, like they're facing some problems, only then that access needs to be enabled for that consumer support or the customer support person. So a very strong role based access control is required over there. Then the other aspects is more around the safety of the cardholder data, wherein you kind of encrypt every data, tokenize it, and so on. Of course, like vulnerability management programs have to be run. What are exactly vulnerability management programs? So you need to have strong security practices within your organization as a payment service provider, that what are the measures that you are taking on a regular basis. How is your data stored? How is it backed up? Whether it is encrypted. So there is a whole guideline around PCI for this. So it's a whole big 6 to 12. These are the major 6 ones, but it's actually a 12-point guideline. And yes, there are regular audits that happen for PCI. So if you fall back or you are non-compliant, you might actually lose out on your license to kind of be a payment service provider, or integrate payment services into your app or your business model. So that's more around the PCI. So if I talk of PCI, one of the important part was basically the safety of cardholder data. And if you built this very strongly, I think the others are more kind of ready made stuff, that it's more of a process driven thing. But the safety of cardholder data is more technical in nature, where the way in which you write your code is kind of dependent on how you kind of implement this piece into your system. So there is one very kind of you can say a best practice or a common way to implement that, which is called tokenization. So it's kind of applicable to any sensitive data, not just credit cards or into the payment industry. And tokenization is mainly a process wherein any sensitive data, be it like credit cards, be it like user data, your email address, anything that is sensitive to your business, if you kind of tokenize it with some unique set of characters, okay, such that your original information is kind of not compromised, okay, and it is kind of uh, kind of unique in that sense also. So tokens can be, you can say, like those GUIDs that you see in any transactions, so those can be tokens for your credit cards. So the way in which it is implemented is kind of the basis of, ensuring the security around your entire system. So in case of like payments, it can be the way in how you implement it, like whether it is one token per wallet, one token per device, or it can be per merchant as well. So if you see different service providers or different payment providers, they have different ways of implementing this, and there is no right or wrong way into this. So it can be just one token for your card which can work across multiple devices, or it can be per device as well. So it purely depends on how robust or how agile your technology piece is in terms of implementing tokenization. And of course there is another layer on top of this which is more into encryption. So after tokenization there can be another layer of encryption as well, to kind of top it up. So how exactly like it works is very simple. Like a credit card, you swipe it at the POS terminal or use it on an e-commerce transaction. It's basically passed through the tokenization system, wherein it generates some random characters. Like it's usually 16 digits or 16 characters, and this 16 characters is then passed on to the merchant system or the payment service provider, which is actually going to process this payment, so that anyone in the flow doesn't get your actual payment or the actual credit card details, and your entire data is kind of secured out there. So how exactly to build this then? So are you going to always kind of create your own algorithms for that, or kind of do stuff which is are you going to always reinvent the wheel? So one important part when you talk of payment systems is that uh, 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 so don't do everything by scratch. Okay, when we talk of payments, try to outsource a lot of things as possible. So just take an example of a bank. They are bankers. How do they kind of manage their banking system? Are they as bankers? So say for example ICICI or Bank of Baroda or HDFC, anyone, are they going to build the banking systems by themselves? No, they are going to build, or they are going to build customizations on top of that. But they are mainly going to take some ready off the shelf products like Finacle or like FlexCube and so on, and that is where the customizations will happen. So these products are already available to them through different like IT providers, and they only need to build the customizations on top of that. So one of the important things, probably from my experience, is that banking systems or payment systems, they generally don't build the entire payment piece by themselves. They outsource as much as possible. But since we as a tech industry, uh, how does how does the tech industry build it? So we need to kind of have robust implementation mechanisms in place, so that we kind of outsource as much as possible when it comes to these banking systems or payment systems. So it can be as simple as using some APIs that are readily available. So if you see like in terms of like PayPal or any credit card implementation, these APIs are readily available to us. So if you are building a business or a web app or an e-commerce site, you are not going to be responsible to build the integration layers for that. You are only going to build the integration points for that. Okay, but beyond that, it is how these payment processing companies work, how they are going to charge. It is not something of your lookout. Okay, you can concentrate more on your business aspects around the your products and your portfolio. And the most liable option or the most feasible option, I would say, is outsource as much as the payment part of it to the payment service providers itself, because since they are responsible for managing that tech piece, they will be managing your PCI compliance and everything. So you just have to call their required APIs and then use as much of it as possible. Another important aspect is, say for example, you need to build it by yourself. Okay, so build everything else, but don't kind of build the credit card pieces by yourself, since that I mentioned that it is kind of involved with the PCI compliance and everything. Okay, so apart from credit cards, okay, you can build anything else. So in terms of anything else, like what can fall into place, so there is something like you can implement the net banking pieces, which is kind of readily available as APIs and so on. Okay, so anything apart from credit cards, whether it is like UPI based, whether it is wallet based, you build it by yourself, and there are no major compliance requirements for that. Yes, of course, like for net banking and all, there will be there, but say for example you have more wallet based stuff and like that. uh, so you won't have too many complications around its security or compliance features. uh, and anything related to credit card, there is a huge backlog of PCI compliance, and how to solve those challenges and so on. So that is where I talk of more outsourcing is kind of easy to achieve versus building it by scratch. So just take an analogy of, you have to write a program to, say for example, sort two numbers, or sort a set of numbers. So you're going to readily use Java or Python or JavaScript, anything that is kind of as a language is available. Okay, you are not going to start from building the language and then you start implementing it. So you readily use the language and then implement the algorithm into it. Similarly, like in terms of payments, okay, you kind of readily use the APIs, okay, or the regulatory requirements that are already implemented, and then kind of implement it in your app, in your system. So that is where like outsourcing comes into picture a lot prominently into payments. uh, yeah. And so then how exactly do we solve these technical challenges around security, encryption, and scalability? So that's probably where like cloud platforms come into picture. And one of the platforms that we see like is like Google Cloud is kind of quite prominently used in terms of payment architectures. Some of the like we'll see like security and encryption is something that Google Cloud or any cloud platform rather is kind of built on that principle. So they kind of work on one principle, which is like trust nothing. So that principle is kind of inherent to any cloud platform. It has different layers of security. Data is always encrypted at rest. uh, you'll see that in terms of scalability aspects, it has a lot of features available to manage scaling aspects, to handle that many number of users, that many number of load, and so on. And it has different, like of course, role based access control. There is IAM on GCP that kind of helps you achieve the earlier aspects or the earlier concepts which I was talking about in terms of uh, those customer based access control and so on. So there is IAM already available in GCP, which kind of helps you build those features on any kind of systems that you're designing. So okay, so in terms of like GCP, how exactly can you achieve an architecture which is kind of PCI compliant? So if you see this architecture, so this is a very standard payment processing architecture, wherein you see here that the customer payment requests are happening. So assume that these are happening either through apps or through mobiles or through web-based applications anywhere. Now there will be definitely a load balancer to handle the scalability aspects to this. So depending on how much of the requests are coming in, this layer can get replicated in terms of its processing power and the way in which it is kind of capturing the data and processing it. So there will be an external payment processor, which you can assume that it is the actual payment service provider that you need to build. Okay, or it can be the Visa, the Mastercard gateways, and so on. Okay, so this is going to be that payment gateway. And this is going to be your application network, so where your application system, so that is like your service that you're providing. Okay, if we leave apart this for a while, so of course there will be like an internal payment authorization or a mechanism to, like, connect to the application gateway and get that right amount of information through, so that you can see here that the interaction between payment processor and application is not direct, but it is happening through the internal payment authorizations and via a VPN. So the security aspect gets handled over here. And in terms of the PCI compliance, so one other important aspect to that is kind of the audit requirements. So when you say audit requirements, what exactly that is? So it's basically storing or kind of having a mechanism in place so that you have all the audit logs in terms of what was processed, how it was processed, what was the kind of volume of transactions that you were handling at that time. So if you see this orange block out here, there is something called as cloud logging, cloud monitoring, and BigQuery. So how these are helping in terms of like the PCI compliance is that if you see in terms of like cloud monitoring, okay, so there is something called as Stack Driver, which is already available on GCP. It helps you kind of create all the custom alerts, or it kind of lets you stay on top of your environments at all the given point of time. So you can also like kind of self audit on whatever you need to kind of see into your systems, or what is happening into it. Yeah. So and when you talk of like BigQuery, it's like more of business intelligence on your terabytes of data that gets processed onto payment systems. You don't need to kind of build different layers on top of that for BI dashboards, or and it gives you a very good transparency in terms of how much data was processed, what was the volume of transactions that is happening, and so on. And another important aspects around PCI is that you have those audit requirements wherein at every given quarter or every given year, before like tax filing, you need to kind of ensure that you are PCI compliant all the given point of time. So how do you kind of store or record that information around your payment system? So cloud logging is something that can help it in terms of evidence of logging. Okay. Now I don't know, like this can be more of a financial term that I'm talking about. Okay, so there can be evidences of your audits or your logging that you're doing. So these logs can be your application logs also, but your application logs should be designed in a manner that it does not contain any sensitive data. You should not have plain text characters for your passwords, credit card details, and so on. So where exactly like cloud logging comes into picture is that you can ensure that whatever is logged is kind of secured, it is stored in an encrypted manner, and whenever the need is, you can kind of retrieve that data, pass it on to BigQuery. So if you see from the architecture diagram, so you're using cloud logging, passing it on to BigQuery, which actually serves as a huge data warehouse in terms of analyzing whatever was processed. And maybe you can kind of have a reconciliation mechanism in place to kind of verify it with the external payment processor. So say for example, in a year or in a given span of time, you kind of have transacted, say for example, 1 million of worth of transactions, but as per your logs, it is coming out to be, say for example, there is a discrepancy wherein it comes out to like say 1.1 million. Okay, so you kind of reconcile it with your payment processor that that zero point 0.1 million transactions was something that was kind of reversed, or they were like fraudulent transactions or something of that sort. Okay, which you can easily come into in it can be easily audited using this mechanism in place. So that is where designing such systems is kind of leading you to PCI compliance in any payment systems that you think of in designing it. So then do we build it all from scratch? So as I was mentioning that in terms of building such systems, so should you build it from scratch, or should you kind of pick something that is readily available? How do you exactly do that? So one beauty of especially when it comes to like Indian payment systems. So let's like kind of confine now the talk into more of Indian payment systems for now. So of course there are other global requirements, and but when you come to like the Indian payment requirement, so there is one very much yeah, you can say a prominent interface that has been developed, and which is like we everyone know that it is UPI. So let me like kind of give you some background around UPI, like how exactly it started off. So somewhere like I guess in 2011 or 2009, I'm not very sure. Uh, RBI probably had done some analytics. Yes, they do analytics as well on your data. So it is not that they are kind of back in technology. They have a good amount of data available with them, and they kind of found out that the number of non-cash transactions, like digital transactions, I would say, okay, is hardly like 6% of what it should be in as compared to for an individual. So if you see that it is a very small fraction of transaction that is happening in terms of digitalization. So it was like way back like 10 or 15 years ago. And at that time they found out that this is not how Indian payment systems should progress. And say for example, like there are like 150 million digital users, or a 10 million retailers that are present, and out of that, if only 6% of that is digital out of it, it's kind of worrisome, because there is a lot of talk around the black money, corruption, and so on, which the government is kind of concerned about. And the only way to solve that is probably through technology and other regulatory mechanisms in place. So apart from the other taxation or regulatory mechanisms in place, they kind of set up NPCI, which is like the National Payments Corporation of India. And they had just one mandate, or one core objective, is to kind of consolidate all payment systems, okay, different service levels countrywide, retail payment systems, everything under one umbrella. Okay, so that was like the core objective of NPCI. And or sorry, yeah, NPCI. And yes, they kind of came up with a very robust solution, which is UPI. It kind of was a regulated platform, real time system. You can say like right now there is IMPS also in place. UPI is kind of like IMPS on steroids. So it kind of helped interbank payments. Okay, and the way in which it was designed, it was like compatible with different app systems. So if you kind of see the next slide, which is more into the architecture of UPI. So you see here like a mobile application, which can be like it can consist of GPay, it can be Phone Pay, Paytm, anything. Banks will have their own interface. Okay, it can be like third party apps, internet banking, anything. Each bank might have its own interface of interacting with the consumer. So just assume that these banks or payments are the PSPs. So if you go back to that earlier diagram which we were talking about, the core of any payment payment flow, okay, there was this player called as payment service provider, or payment mediator. Okay, so bank is that mediator in this case. Now they kind of built another mediator on top of that, okay, which is the UPI. Okay, and this mediator is kind of responsible for anything, whether it is your NACH, or which is like your EMI payments, your IMPS, RuPay, any other payment servicing that happens. Okay, it can be done via UPI itself. So yes, it will have some central repository, it will have a mechanism to kind of connect to any of these banks. Okay, and via the banks you connect to any of the consumers. And a good part is that I think it also now has the USD based payments as well. So it's like if you don't even have an internet connection, you can still make a payment. So The whole idea behind this is kind of, any UPI based application or system that you are designing. uh, the whole concept over here is that payment systems have to be as simple as possible. And you kind of be it like buying a movie ticket or buying some groceries for yourself, or even at a rural place, the same system has to be applied everywhere. So it's more regulated, but it's also easy to use. So be it like any time of the day, any time of the year, the payment system should be able to handle that load, should be able to work at any given point of time. So that's more of the crux of how UPI is kind of designed. And if we see that way, like India has kind of prominently used UPI, and it's kind of very successful in that sense. Okay, the way it has been designed, and it of course has been very useful, and some other countries are also now kind of studying this model and trying to implement it at their places. Especially like developing economies, especially in the African continent, they are kind of seeing this as a very good alternative to make payment being enabled faster for everyone. So if we go back to the basics, so if we see that first diagram, where exactly how does UPI come into picture? So just understand that these orange arrows that you're seeing, okay, these are the actual financial transactions that are happening, whereas the green blocks are the non-financial, or you can say these are more of the audit or the technical transactions that are happening. So it is more of request response layers which is happening, and then giving back to the user and so on. So if there is a payer service provider, there is a payee service provider. Okay, each one, so the payer has its own bank, the payee has its own bank. So say for example, you are buying something from an e-commerce platform. So consider like you're buying something from a website. Okay, and you're kind of, so website will have its own bank, you as a consumer will have your own bank. So this is like you as a consumer, this is the e-commerce merchant. So in this case, like let's assume that is website or something else, or Pantaloons, or any other retailer that you can think of. So you try to scan that barcode over there, your payment is kind of requested. When that request is made, okay, there is a request authorization that happens from the payee, that you are the person who is actually going to make that payment. So it sends a response back. So when you scan that barcode, right, on any merchant place, okay, so the first thing that happens is an authorization happens, that okay, this is going to this merchant only, it is not going somewhere else. Like you scan it to website and it doesn't go to Pantaloons, or it doesn't go to any other retailer, right? So that response happens over there. Now once that happens, uh, so that response is given back. If the response is successful, what will happen is your bank is kind of now happy to make that remittance. Okay, so your account is kind of debited from that. Okay, and you see that the beneficiary bank is credited, and it's all like kind of real time, right? So once the beneficiary bank is kind of credited, it's kind of instant. Okay, and you get the payee, that is the service provider, gets a transaction confirmation, and that response is kind of sent back to you as a payer. Okay, and that is when you get that pop-up of confirm, that okay, yes, your payment has been confirmed or not. And any kind of breakages in this flow, okay, uh, of course there is a mechanism wherein the transactions get reversed. I'm only undergoing the pay flow, okay, not the refund flow. Okay, so this whole layer that has been designed, okay, it's all because of the UPI interface. It's entirely API driven. Okay, so you don't have to write that payment piece in place. Okay, you just have to call those APIs, interface it with your bank. Okay, and that is where, like, you, when I say interface it with your bank, you only have to provide your banking details, and everything else gets taken care of. So the whole piece around this all arrows that you are seeing, or the way in which this has been designed. Okay, you as an individual, when I say as an individual, I'm talking more from the channel perspective or from the service provider perspective. You don't have to build any of these layers. Okay, you just have to call or get the right amount of data through. Okay, and it kind of gets taken care of by these platforms. Okay, so what kind of lies ahead in terms of UPI? So Google Pay, and especially for India, it kind of holds a very special category when it comes to Google Pay, because India is the only country that has kind of made Google Pay customize it for itself. And one of the reason is UPI is the platform that is behind it. So Google Pay platform kind of was there since quite a bit of time. So there was Pay for Android, it kind of evolved, and then there was Google Pay, and now yeah, of course, it is now still Google Pay. And it's kind of evolving into more areas. Like there is an transit system which is in place. You can use the Spot platform. It's kind of evolving more onto the Spot platform, wherein you can do a lot more things apart from payment. So yeah, for India, it is kind of a very special thing that Google Pay is more customized for India, and then UPI is kind of responsible for that. So let me play you a very short video of how the Google Pay API implementation happens.
Here is how you can integrate Google Pay for your
Let me
e-commerce
see if I can
website
full
in
screen
4
this.
simple steps. Load the Google Pay API JavaScript library. Determine readiness to pay. Add the Google Pay button. Create a payment data request object. First, you add the script tag to your site. As soon as the script is loaded, you will construct the payments client object by passing it to an environment field, test or production. For the test environment, you don't need to register with Google. You can play with the API yourself and integrate into your site. In this case, we do show users real data. However, whenever they make a selection, we will return you a fake token. If you are working with one of the supported processors, we will return you a token which you can use in their test environment. Remember, your real card details are never used when in environment test, but you must add at least one chargeable card to your Google account before you proceed. Once you complete the integration and you are ready to handle real payments, come and register with us through our self-service portal and then flip the environment to production.
Okay, so I'll just take a pause over here and just tell you that how easy it is to implement this whole mechanism over here. Okay, so if you okay, so I believe like the video is not visible. I think it is not getting played on the slides. Okay, but it's kind of playing on my local. No worries, I'll post the YouTube link for that. Okay, and maybe y'all can view it at a leisure time. But what I mean to kind of explain out here is that it's more of API driven out here when you talk of the Google Pay API implementation. And it's just a matter of calling the right library in place. When you call that library, there is just a few method calls which are required, which will kind of enable the payment for you, and then you can start using it in your web applications, in your mobile applications, and so on. So what I'll do is like kind of explain. So is this next slide visible? I think the slides are no longer visible, so let me kind of stop sharing and share again. Okay, so I think the slides went off for a moment, and I think they are visible now. Can probably someone confirm if the slides are visible? I can see it on the stream. Okay, cool. Thanks, Nide, for confirming. Okay, so if I had to like explain like how exactly this API works, so just kind of relate this back to the previous diagram which I was talking about. Okay, so the user phone number, which is kind of key for API integration in terms of like for the UPI payments. Okay, so the merchant front end, okay, it can be a web app, it can be a POS terminal. So POS terminals will work with the barcode. If it's a web app, it will work with the VPA address. Okay, so they kind of pre-populate using the phone numbers or on their app or website. Okay, once the user confirms, the merchant makes a call to request the payment. So you can see here that the payment request is made from the merchant server. And so this is an more of an omni-channel API. So this API is kind of responsible, okay, for any platform. So it can be a mobile, it can be an app, or even it can be a POS terminal as well. So once the payment request is authorized from the GPay user, so have you seen that when you kind of go to a merchant or on a POS terminal especially, and you say that you want to pay by UPI, but neither you scan a barcode, but they kind of enable the payment for you. So how they do it, like on the merchant front end, they kind of feed in your mobile number, which is linked with your GPay user. Okay, and that is where this payment request happens. So it requests a payment, you get an SMS and a pop-up on your GPay screen, okay, that a payment has been requested. Once you authorize it, the response is sent back to the merchant server, and the payment status is reflected back on the merchant front end. So as soon as you kind of authorize the payment, merchant sees that it has been confirmed, and so the payment service provider basically has confirmed that payment. In this case, the PSP is basically Google Pay, and it is kind of authorizing the payment. So say for example, you are going out to buy donuts for yourself, you kind of key in your mobile number at MOD, and you pay it via Google Pay. Your donuts are ready to eat by the time you even they are not even cooked, and your payment is already done. So that's how in crux, like how the Google Pay API works. So it's more evolutionary, I would say, in terms of the whole tech piece. It's not just payments. Okay, there are a lot of things that are coming up along with payments. Okay, so say for example, with payments, you can, like, of course you can buy different stuff in terms of the services. So it can be your tickets, it can be like movie tickets, it can be airline tickets as well. So when you talk of like airline tickets, then with the tickets, do you also generate the barcodes, or like the boarding passes for that? So the pay platform itself, okay, so it is kind of evolved into the spot platform. Okay, and this platform, you can then use it for more additional user experience, or enhancing the user experience. And that is where this platform is kind of evolving. So you can see that from a payment platform, okay, it is evolving into a multi-user experience. It can be a loyalty platform. So say for example, it can be a Starbucks reward, or a book my show voucher, and so on. So everything kind of drills down into one platform, and it's all because of the underlying payment experience that has been given. So you see that since the payment experience, or the efforts to build the payment is kind of simplified, the business can concentrate more on the user experience. So it enhances the user experience by giving more loyalty or any rewards and so on. And that's where like kind of the whole payment ecosystem is kind of moving into. So yeah, that's more of sure. So I'll take up some of the questions shortly. So that's more about the payment architectures or the ecosystem. So if you kind of now kind of relate into this, okay, so this is how like NPCI is. Okay, and if you go back to my first diagram, which I had explained around the payment request flow, and try to fit in those blocks over there. So there is a payee, there's a payment mediator, which is like the payment bank, or the Google Pay is happening over here. There is a payer payment app, there's a payment mediator, there's a bank involved, and the payer is basically the merchant in this case. So everything is kind of spread still holding true to the original payment request flow, which is kind of a standard protocol for anything. And everything related to PCI compliance, or since this is Google Pay is more bank to bank, it still has its own layers of tokenization and security mechanisms in place. So even if it is your credit card that you have linked, or your any other payment processor that you have linked, it's all kind of secured. So if I have to like tell you about like scalability, I think you don't need to worry about in terms of scalability aspects. So when you as a merchant, okay, are implementing GPay, okay, you don't have to worry about scalability. Why? Because it's kind of a serverless piece for you. Okay, the load on payment is kind of managed from the Google side of things, or from Google Cloud, or from GPay. Okay, and you are responsible for managing the traffic on your site. So if, as far as if your site is kind of able to handle that traffic, payment is something that you won't worry about. And in terms of PCI compliance, any system, even if you are building a GPay based system, just ensure that you have the right amount of logging and monitoring in place. Okay, so that any future audit requirement, so you never know like what kind of regulations the RBI comes up with. So let's say it's ask you for a historical data of the past 2 to 3 years, then how are you going to show that? Just ensure that when you kind of build these systems, it is kind of having these nuances in place when you kind of take care of the payment industry. UPI, of course, try to use it as much as possible in any of your flows. Okay, since it is kind of very easy, and the whole idea of it is to enhance the user experience for payments. And especially like in Indian payment systems, it is something that you can easily achieve using GPay based APIs. So yeah, that's more of the talk around payment architecture systems. Maybe like in this given short span of time, I think I can cover as much as possible. uh, the future talks can be more around, I can deep dive you all into Google Pay, how to implement it for a web piece, and we can do a demo and a walkthrough of that. But yeah, just feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. It's my first name and last name, Dharmesh Vaya, or Twitter, it is @DRVAYA. Before like kind of I end up, I'm happy to kind of take up some questions. So I'll go through the questions as I see them. So yeah, so the first question, how do we go about in selecting the payment integrators? That's by like Nirav Kothari. So payment integrators, so basically if you talk in terms of like Indian payment ecosystem, so uh, there are some standard guidelines which have been laid out, and you don't see much of competition between them. One important aspects as a business that you must see is the different the chargeback model that is applied with these payment integrators. So if you see like CC Avenue, or any of the other merchant gateways or the payment gateways that you see, I think the merchants require to process around 2% of the payment back to these, and there is a licensing fee involved. Versus I think if as a merchant, if you implement something like UPI, it's completely free of cost for you. So if you are scaling up as a new merchant, maybe like UPI is something that you want to go through. And as you scale ahead, once you see some traction in terms of revenue, maybe you want to go for the charged models with the paid payment integrators, where 2% of the transaction would not make much of a difference for you if the volumes are too high. So that is like maybe how you can select the payment integrators. And then when we talk of like the next question is again by Nirav. When you talk of payment integrators, do they all support all modes of payment like wallets, net banking, or do we have to select different integrators for different payments? So yes, there is a high chance that so nowadays, like since they have evolved very much, it is like basically one payment integrator is supporting almost every payment mechanism. So if you kind of go for that license fee, I think internally also they have some licensing structure that if you allow net banking and credit cards, you have to pay an X amount of fee. If you want to allow credit cards, there is another fee for that. So as a payment integrator, they might allow all kinds of payment mechanisms or payment modes, but they might have a different licensing mode for that. And depending on your business and volumes, okay, you might want to choose the best feasible one for you. uh, Let me take up some more next questions. Okay, so Nide Indurkar is asking that apart from Google Pay integration, uh, yeah, for Indian payments, can you please tell aspects to be considered for international payments? Okay, so since like Google Pay is more into like Indian based payment systems, however, I think it is going to roll out shortly, even like if you want to do cross border payments. Okay, but if you're talking of international payments, okay, you need to make use of certain guidelines and protocols which are laid down by Swift, okay, which is more of cross border payment transaction that can be handled by that gateway. Okay, and international payments have different regulatory requirements. So if you're making a payment, like say from example India to US or India to uh, uh, Russia or UK, okay, each country might have a different regulatory requirement, and these guidelines are laid out from the government organizations or their payment corporations. So just like in India we have NPCI, US, Russia, South Africa, any country would have their own payment mechanisms in place to enable cross border payments. So the main reason for this is that when you talk of cross border payments, there is a high chance that uh, or a high chance of fraudulent activities or or corrupt activities in place. The reason is that you will never come to know that where exactly the transaction has been taken place from, what is the geolocation and so on. So you need to be considerate of all these factors, especially for international payments, since the regulatory requirements for cross-border payments are very stringent, and due to the nature of transactions that can happen. So say for example, like I'll give you an example. A fraudulent activity was caught recently by a place where I work at, and that place was kind of, they were simulating a local transaction, but the transaction was used to buy a vehicle or a car. Okay, and it was taking place from some Southeast Asian country. Now since we had those mechanisms in place to kind of find out where this transaction was occurring from, and it was more of a money laundering activity that was taking place. So uh, in actual, there was no car being purchased. Okay, it was more of a funds that were moving across from country to country. And we found out that due to because of the reconciliation and the regulation that was laid down by the government. So every country, like if there is an international transaction that is happening, the local bank, which is like, I mean, the reserve bank of that country needs to know that transaction, and there are thresholds for that. So if there is a transaction, say for example about 2 lakh, you need to kind of report it to the government and report it to the RBI and so on. Similarly, for international payments also, this reporting mechanism is something that you should that has to be built mandatorily. And as soon as that alert goes in, they kind of do all the required due diligence related to the customer, related to the person who is making that payment and so on. And if they find it like kind of any discrepancy in that payment is kind of stopped there and there, and the kind of transaction doesn't go through. So it's more of regulatory things that you need to take care of apart from technical stuff. Technically, I think I would say, like as per my experience, if you enable the one time password stuff, it actually serves a lot of it's a lot of relief from the consumer perspective, since you know that you are the only person who is making that transaction, and then the transaction is more authorized. So as a consumer, it's your one time payment passcodes that kind of make you more comfortable which is kind of not there still in other countries also, but they're trying to implement that. Uh, a comparison on GPay and Paytm. Kind of GPay and Paytm are, I would say, different platforms. Each of them is trying its own niche. Okay, GPay is more of UPI and reward based platform, whereas Paytm is kind of getting into a bit of other areas where it can kind of integrate into a lot of services. So what you can see in terms of so each has its own advantages and disadvantages. Okay, and if you talk in terms of like GPay and Paytm, GPay is kind of, it gives you a very good user experience irrespective of where you are making the payment from. So whether you're purchasing a ticket for Book My Show or you're purchasing a Metro card, the interface remains the same. For Paytm, it differs a bit because you have to, there is a bit of workflow involved, wherein in Paytm you kind of go to that particular merchant, buy that ticket, and then kind of store that information around that platform. Another added thing on Paytm is that probably the payment systems are linked to these merchants in terms of, like, say for example, metro tickets and so on, wherein on Paytm you can readily see those metro tickets, whereas on GPay you cannot see that. But yeah, GPay has a system called as open loop transit, which is implemented in some of the countries to have that same experience, just like you see in Paytm, where your barcode based tickets are also present, and you can kind of see them on the go itself. So yeah, I would say like those are two very different payment services. Paytm internally is using UPI and wallets, whereas GPay is only UPI based payments. I would not say they are wallet based. How much flexibility GPay gives us compared to other payment gateways? That's an interesting question. So it actually boils down to the user experience. Okay, uh, if you had to go and buy a movie ticket, okay, and you had to swipe a card versus like use GPay, which is faster? Probably, swiping the card might be faster, or it can be a quicker alternative. However, GPay gives you a more seamless experience. There is less of physical interaction with any POS terminal or the merchant itself. Okay, and that is where, like, it kind of boils down to the user experience that these platforms give. So as I mentioned earlier, like any payment systems, they are like kind of distinguishing themselves by the amount of features and services that they are providing, and that is where they are kind of getting evolved in the recent times. Okay, Nide, your question around Stripe payments, Razorpay, PayU, how they are different from GPay or any other service providers. Well, Stripe, Razorpay, all. So Stripe is a different one. Razorpay is a different. Razorpay, PayU, etc. are more of payment gateways or payment service providers, and within Razorpay and PayU, you would see one option as UPI or GPay into it. So I would say GPay is still a small subset of these payment service providers, and it's kind of more of like UPI is a platform, okay, and GPI is an enabler for that platform, whereas Razorpay, PayU, etc. are gateways that enable these platforms for you. So these are more of so it kind of goes back to the same question that Nirav had asked earlier. Okay, that what are the payment integrators and how do we choose them? So it kind of it helps you decide that if you want to go for a very simple UPI based payment only, okay, you choose GPay. Whereas if you want to have more payment mechanisms in place, like credit card, debit card, net banking, or even PayPal, for example, uh, you can have these payment gateways, Razorpay, PayU, so on, in place, since they give you more leverage in terms of the type of payment instruments that you can use, versus like GPay, it is only like UPI based payments that you can integrate into itself. uh, in So the next question is like Okay, so feel free to, if I'm answering your questions, or you have any counter questions on top of that, like Nide, Nirav, Swapnil, anyone, if you have more questions, just kind of reply back on the chat. I'm able to see that. I'll take up the next question. Uh, so when you say flexibility, is it easy to build custom modules around GPay to have analytics over it? Yes, of course. When you say like building it with any other service provider, or like versus GPay, the flexibility that you are getting out here is the effort involved, okay, in terms of building that payment module, uh, is something more of just a library call that you need to make, okay, versus if you had to build it from scratch by yourself. I think it would take ages for you to incorporate all the security features, all the compliance features, and so on. So it becomes more developer friendly, so that you can concentrate more on enabling or expanding the service of your business. And since you can have definitely all the analytics in place. So if you like kind of go back to this diagram over here, yeah, so the merchant over here. So on this merchant server, okay, if you like kind of again, sorry, go back to this place, okay. So that, let's assume that this VPC, okay, is basically your merchant server, including your application network. Now if you see via the payment gateways, or via the proxies, okay, uh, if you enable like cloud logging and BigQuery, okay, this is where the analytics comes into picture, okay. And that is where you can enable all the required analytics for your business, so you can kind of check what product is being sold, like, and versus for which category of age group or users, since like GPay can probably give you those details to you, and with that demographics you can improvise your business also. I hope that answers your query. Okay, so okay, and in terms of reward based on the number of transactions and amount, so well, that is kind of more internal to GPay, and the way in which those rewards and amounts are kind of given out on GPay is more campaign based, okay. But yes, it's kind of tying up with different merchants and different service provider to give different type of reward. So for example, if you made a transaction at say for example a travel portal, okay, they might give you a reward for, say for example, 10% off on your next booking or your holiday booking, and so on. So if you booked a flight ticket, you might get a 10% off on your hotel booking. So that kind of analytics, or that kind of real time insights on your platform helps you give the right type of campaigns related to it, and it definitely helps in improving the user experience. uh, Demo to integrate GPay with web app, sure, but I think I would kind of need some maybe time to kind of get that demo ready. I don't have anything right now. Maybe I can take up another session if anyone is interested. Maybe Ramya or Sohail can kind of set up that session, which is more of the next part to this, which will be more into integrating or actual hands-on with GPay and a web app or a mobile app, whichever is like convenient. I can take that session as a next step to this, since like right now we are running short of time, and the demo is not something that can be readily made available. It will create a bit. I mean, it will need a bit of efforts to kind of keep it ready and have it for the session. So maybe like you can set up some next session for that, and happy to include that demo as well. I I think I'm done with almost all the questions that were there on the live comments. Maybe like Ramya, if you have more questions, or if there are more questions coming in on the feed, just give me a shout, and I'll be happy to answer them.
Yeah, sure, sir.
Mhm.
And if possible, we can make a session in the near future regarding the GPay demo with web apps or any application. With
Yes,
regarding your schedule, we can match a schedule and we can set up a meetup in the near future. And
sure.
also, thanks a lot from our team for taking out time from your busy schedule and and nearly taking a detailed description of what payment architecture is, and also taking out many analogies, and also binding with many applications. That's been a really great insights on payment architecture. Thanks a lot, and thanks to each one of the attendees for taking out time from your schedules as well and attending today's session. And also, if you have any questions, you can ping us, or you can directly contact Dharmesh sir, and he'll be ready to answer your questions. And also, we'll be sending a feedback form regarding today's sessions, and you can fill in your questions in that form as well, and we can directly forward that to sir as well. So I think that works
Sure.
as well. Yeah, we
Yeah.
can directly send you the document, and you can answer those questions, and we can send the document to the attendees. Even we can do that, and that would be easy for you. uh, so we can
Sure.
send you all the
That
questions together from the, yeah.
Yeah, no problem. So as soon as you have
uh,
some feedback or more questions, just feel free to shoot it to me,
yeah,
and you all have my mail ID. Probably you can drop in a mail to me as well,
yeah,
and I
sure,
can take up those questions. So otherwise,
sure.
like thanks to GDG Nagpur, Ramya, and team, and for inviting me. Thanks to the audience. Thanks for asking some great insights. That questions were kind of quite that added light to the talk. And yeah, thanks a lot for attending the show. Feel free to connect back. Any questions or discussions that you need to happen, I'm happy to take that up. And yeah, you can plan some future sessions around specifically some deep dive onto GPay. I'll be glad to take them up.
Sure, sir. Pleasure is ours. Thanks a lot,
Sure.
and
Thank you so
yeah,
much.
stay safe.
All right. Cheers. Bye, everyone.